To this Silver Sands webinar. My name, like I said, is Ross Parry. I'm one of the account managers here, and we're delighted to be joined by our user adoption consultant, Andy Petman, who will be guiding us through developing a management plan for Microsoft 365. So Andy will be bringing you expert advice today and helping you to get started on your journey to create that plan for your organization. Before Andy does that, I will just kick off with a very quick introduction to Silver Sands in a slide. So Silver Sands have been in business for over 30 years. We're a professional services organisation specialising in Microsoft 365 and cloud hybrid IT for enterprise users. So we have a quick look on the slide that we've got here. There's a couple of areas that we focus on. So the large circle at the top is Microsoft 365, and this contains three key components. Firstly, we have Office 365, which features Teams, apps like Teams, SharePoint, and OneDrive. The second component is Windows 10, which is obviously our desktop operating system. And thirdly, it is Enterprise Mobility and Security. So that's for managing and securing all our endpoint devices. If we take a look at the large circle on the bottom left, we have the Power Platform for business applications, reporting and dashboards through the use of Power Apps, Power Automate and Power BI. And the large circle bottom right is Microsoft Azure. And in this area, we deliver both on-premise and cloud infrastructure into hybrid IT solutions. Between the large circles, we have identity management, governance and security, all of which are very crucial aspects to any technical implementation. We obviously aim to enable a protected end user experience, and then linking all these circles together is our support offerings, which provide managed and ad hoc support. Finally, at the heart of what we do, in the center of the graphic, is people and devices. This should always be the focus for any business change activity. And to support technical deliveries, we have built a highly skilled user adoption capability, where our change management team work closely with your business users to understand their current level and any challenges they may encounter adopting new technologies. So from that, they help you to decide how best to use your Microsoft 365 licenses within your organization, and they put in place a framework to encourage more productive ways of working. So that's Silver Sands in a slide. I would now like to welcome Andy, who will kick off the webinar.
Lovely, thank you, Ross. First of all, I see with the number of people on here, one or two I've seen before. I don't see the Teams window while I'm presenting because of the way I've got my screen set up. So if there's anybody else joined that I either do or don't know, welcome. This is the third of 3 webinars where I'm introducing the idea of operational management around Microsoft 365 platform as a service from Microsoft. If you have any questions during the webinar, please put them into the chat window, and if they can be answered as we go, Ross will respond to them, or we can top them up at the end and ask them. Because it's quite a small group of people, if you do have any questions, raise your hand and Ross can bring you in. I won't see that, so if I carry on talking, I'm not ignoring you, but we'll bring you in as and when we can do, because I think getting a dialogue about this can be really useful. Just before we go into the content of today, I'm just going to give a slight review of where we got to. So the last 2 sessions have been around thinking of what an operational management group would look like to support the platform as a service from Microsoft. So however you've got to Microsoft 365, whatever you've enabled already, whether it's all, some, very little, whether you're in quandaries even now about what to turn on, what to not to turn on, whether you're getting certain pressures from outside of the Microsoft 365 environment, both by things that we've all had to respond recently to around COVID, or any changes that are affecting your organization, either internally or externally, about the way you work and the way you operate within compliance and regulation. You might have some internal changes making a pressure on the way that you've deployed and using whatever flavor of Microsoft 365 you have already. They'll be making demands on you as either a service if you're in IT, or as an organization if you're more within the business. And then you've also got the big S and the little s around strategy. So you've got your own internal thinking about how you want to use Microsoft 365. Now you've got it, and you may already be developing some of those thoughts. But then there's also the larger organizational strategy about where the organization might want to go. Some of its organizational aims, the 1 to 3 to 5 year organizational plans, and possibly how you can use some of your Microsoft investment to be able to support some of those changes in the way that the organization expects you to work, either how you work, who you work with, where you work, and that sort of thing. So the idea of the round circle of operational management is really building a capability or a team, depending on the size of your organization, to be able to deal with these sort of things that come up in an agile way. And I mean that with a little a. This is just about the agility, the responsiveness of your environment to be able to take on some of these challenges. If you have a big restructure and you need to reorganize some of your SharePoint or Teams or other storage locations that are in 365, who do they go to? How quickly can you ramp up the expertise necessary to be able to respond to that restructure? I've worked around in IT long enough that most of those sort of conversations normally come in about the day before they're needed. So while furnitures, fixtures, fittings, and sometimes people can be quite quick to mobilize, a lot of the conversations around Microsoft 365 become a lot more difficult when you're looking at perhaps sensitive data and the teams that are moving out of that function shouldn't have access anymore. How do you deal with that separation? How do you deal with the permissions around that separation? How do you deal with changes from Microsoft as they come in, sometimes unbidden, sometimes well announced, and sometimes gated, so you can actually assess the impact of that change before it hits the wider user community around your organization? And around that circle, all of those boxes have some sort of outside influence, outside drive that might need the convening of a group of people quite quickly. So part of the work around operational management is actually to look at that as an ongoing, enduring team that you set up either at the beginning of a project of implementation, or you set it up during or even after the implementation of Microsoft 365 to be able to respond to that sort of demand. Now, this is just a review of what we talked about last time, of when do we start talking about operational management for the service. And I think I used the example of my last organization I worked with fully around SAP or SAP. As a major implementation of a capability, needed a big review of internal people and processes. It needed a massive training campaign, and then it needed a massive transition from old systems to new, and then a major transition between old support processes and new for a completely new environment. That meant development, that meant support, that meant about education and communications. And it also talked about introducing the analysis required to be able to identify new opportunities to really make use of the best of SAP, as most organizations will never turn everything of SAP on. How do you then go about commissioning new pieces of work for either a project module or a finance module or something else? And why, in a way, should 365 be any different? And the reason I asked that, because that's a challenge I gave to myself on one of my previous employments, where we implemented Microsoft 365 very quickly as a response to a license uplift, and then thought, as we started deploying the application without any thought or control, actually, what does it mean to own a platform like Microsoft 365? And I mentioned on one of the last sessions, I was lucky enough to go through like a merging organization to almost think of Microsoft 365 a second time, almost cleanly from scratch. And not many organizations will have the chance to apply lessons learned in such a practical way. And I found that was really quite cathartic, because then we could look at everything we'd done for the first iteration and really reinvent the whole wheel about how do we do 365 adoption, compliance, control, support, all of the pieces I mentioned on the previous slide. But how do we bring together something that can look at that and actually deal with the responsiveness of an emerging organization that was going through almost all of the demands on there, apart from COVID? We had major restructure issues, major restructure concerns, and then we had regulatory changes about the new services we were bringing in under statutory services on a government organization. And it really brought to bear the fact that it wasn't any right time for me. The right time for me was the time I started thinking about it differently and took a case back to the senior management team about some investment needed. And I talked about the very end of that slide there with the question mark. And the cold answer is there is no end to your investment in Microsoft 365 until you stop paying for the subscription. And in a way, for you to make the best of your service, to make the best of what the users can get access to, and to make the best controlled environment that you can, it does require some nurturing over a long period of time. It's not only for the duration of a project. I think I've gone around that one, but that's just really to remind you of the model. And I'm actually going to stop here for a second and say, okay, so what? I mentioned this last time. I always ask myself the so what one, either as a project manager or in terms of thinking about how we can make a difference to the way that people work and help them understand what they can do, why they could do it, and where they can go to get the support to do that work. And the so what question is actually a really good one for operational management, because it's relatively new in a lot of organizations. It's a new concept that organizations might have gone through the license uplift without thinking about the platform. They might have implemented things quickly because of COVID or because of other applications they've seen could be really valuable to the way they work. So what about doing operational management? And this really helps me define the rest of this session, because I'm going to use a couple of scenarios I've come across with the so what. And that is really what is the starting point of operational management, and how do you build the enduring people and processes around that team? So the so what could be, I'm at the beginning of implementing Microsoft 365 and I want to do the best for my organization. That is what I mentioned last time, the utopian, that we actually think about the people we bring together to deliver Microsoft 365, and then keep a presence of all of those people that can then support the, I call it churn, it's a lot more than that, but the change and the outside influences, everything that we need to think about as a group to run the service against that outside boxes I've got on that chart. It's thinking at the beginning of the project, scaling it, budgeting it, having the management buy-in at the very beginning, and we have what would be an enduring process afterwards. Now that would probably suit, and it does suit, organizations I've worked with where they already have quite mature service management processes around some of their line of business applications. That's a really, really good start. And if I'd have done it the first time properly, we might have had an operational management team. But refining the way we approach that on the merging and the second iteration of an installation allowed me to really think about that in the agile, quick way of bringing together a team that don't do a lot of the work, but they facilitate and ensure that the work gets done by a wider group of people that can support that team. Another reason that you might be thinking about it is you've lost some data. You've lost a file, you lost some sensitive information. Could be internally to a team that shouldn't have seen something. Around something highly sensitive, commercial in confidence, social care information to put a real context around it. Even internally to the wrong teams, that could be quite a big bit of an issue. And with the tools that we have with Microsoft 365, we now place an onus on the end user with a lot greater degree of impact about how they share their information with people inside and outside the organization. So a data breach is potentially a lot more possible under Microsoft 365. And as we know at the technical level, there are probably some really good controls and tools we could do. But again, it's just the so what principle. Today, I have a problem. How do I respond to that? And how do I start to think about the type of people that need to be brought in to respond to that type of issue that's been raised? Another one could be that something fundamental changes with an application. And that fundamental change could actually be quite a large impact. It could change completely one of the products. It could actually decommission it and bring it out into a different area. We've got bookings come out as a live application in the application list for Microsoft that replaced a capability called Staff Hub a little while ago. How did we, and this was real for my organization previously, how do we actually pull together the people required to go through assessing the impact of what the change was, what it meant to the user to go from one type of rota system to another, what they could migrate and what they couldn't migrate, when the access from Microsoft was going to be made for the new one and taken away from the old one, forced on users, after a period of leeway where we could do our own management. Bringing together a team to respond to that type of change actually isn't as simple as it sounds if you don't have that team or the people and processes almost identified at the beginning of that process. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of those scenarios in practical terms about how they could be responded to and how almost each of those scenarios could give you a starting point for your operational management team. Just to cover a little bit about what I talked about where to start. That's actually a valid point. Most of the people, and I was in the same place with this with my previous organization. In a way, I didn't know where to start. There wasn't an awful lot of information out in the outside world, so I've got itchy nose. I'm just getting rid of that. We've got there wasn't an awful lot of information out in the outside world, but I did have some really good internal support models and service management and service operation models I could piggyback off. So I didn't have a completely zero starting point, but it is a really valid point that a lot of people may not at the moment, especially a small organization with less or small or even no line of business application support. Is a really good question to ask. I don't know. And that's really what this is about. We might have some people at the beginning to say, actually, we know operational management makes sense. We've already had a couple of problems in the way we're running. We have a couple of opportunities to grow the use of Microsoft 365 or expand the way that our applications are used or even to turn on new applications. I like the idea of it, but I don't really know what my starting point is yet. I mentioned earlier, we might have lost a file or we might have lost sensitive data. Might get asked a question, can we allow external sharing? It might be a question that you've already asked as an organization. If you get it for the first time, how do you start bringing together the team to start having that conversation? Somebody else might have a burning issue and it might be an organizational pressure to have accessibility built into new products you deploy. How do you bring together the right people to have that conversation to say, yes, the inbuilt accessibility tools are acceptable, or we need to do some more work to work with our internal groups to make sure that we're deploying products that are compliant with, for example, our technologies that we already use, our screen readers or any other accessibility tools we have. But it's a bigger question than just about technology. It's about attitudes towards accessibility as well. When do we turn something on? I know we're working with somebody in, for example, for me, the NHS, and they use Teams. We weren't at the time. And it was a really big pressure because it was an ideal opportunity to make the best use of something when someone else is already using it. But what do we need to do to make sure we're ready to turn that on for some of our people and to make the best use of it? Changes in the applications occur sometimes daily, it feels like, sometimes weekly, and sometimes with and sometimes without good communication from Microsoft. Have I used a product properly? Have I used it safely? Have I used it organizationally in a legal or compliant fashion? And someone's seen something they should not. It's a bit like the lost a file. I'm aware of something happening. Who do I talk to? Who do I talk to when I think I've done something wrong? So all of these questions are drivers towards the first starting point of thinking about operational management. Now, I mentioned in my last organization, we did a license uplift and we actually turned on almost all applications unless there was a license implication. And before we did that, we did think about what should and should be turned on, but we didn't really have a strategy on how to deal with that. So we just turned on the applications. Now, the first question for me to think about when we were looking at operational management, and this was less about operational management as a discipline, this is just thinking about how to deal with the problem that operational management as a concept started to pull together an idea about how this could look. So the first problem I had is, what is the state of my environment? Where are my applications? What are my users doing with those applications? And that was actually a really, really clear starting point for me because it made it very practical. It made it very small in terms of an exercise. And at the time, I didn't really notice it, but it turned into actually the Bible for operational management for the organization I left. And the first thing I did was to say, OK, what is the state of our environment? What have we got? And the easiest way to do that was just to do a list. No more difficult than that. Find out every application is available. Find out what the intent of the application is, where it's not known, and most of them are obviously a lot more in our consciousness now, but some of those applications do have some real nuances in the way that people can work, and some of them even are very similar. They have very similar look, feel, features, and it's understanding what the best use case is for each of those applications. But this was a really good starting point, because you could have a list of all 30 plus applications. You could define the ones that you don't have turned on, easy. You can define the ones you have turned on, straightforward from the admin console, and then you may have already some idea of plans that you have in the future to turn some of the applications on. For me, that was a real win, because then that meant I already had some idea of what was in use and what we had turned off. That then allows me to make decisions. The ones that are turned off, is there any plans to turn on by anybody outside of my environment? And when it was a no, that was easy. I could discount them for now. If there was a plan to turn an application on, but it was far enough away for me, again, it was easy. I could discount it for now. And then I could just start to look at some of the applications that are out there, and I could start thinking about some questions. What of those applications out there present to me the biggest risk, or in my case, to my organization, to the risk managers that actually were in existence in the organization? So the first question might be that, okay, I've got a number of applications out there, and in my case, it was I think I had about 24 turned on without any controls around them whatsoever. The first one is, what application should I start with? And in a way, I've got in here applications and capabilities, because Microsoft 365 is just bigger than the 31-ish applications today. I think it is in total. It is also capabilities that allow us to work with the applications. So we've got productivity tools, we've got planner, we've got bookings, the applications in physical terms. But when we are talking about the use in safe and legal terms, in internal or external regulatory terms, when we're talking about just using the applications in the way that makes sense to us, we do also have to think about the policies, the labels, the controls that can be applied to make those applications work in the right way. And operational governance, in my mind, when we're first thinking about this, encompasses all of those. So which application should I start with? And that is, for me, again, for the organization I was in any organization that we talk to now, it comes back to the same question. What is your appetite for risk? What are the applications that present you the most risk? And which ones do you feel you need to address urgently to apply a level of control? Now, that is as simple or as complicated as saying, right, for example, in front of me, I have 20 applications. They're all green because they're all turned on. And I have discussed with some senior managers, one in the risk team or business assurance, somebody in the information governance team and somewhere else. What is the biggest scare we have on our organization at the moment? And it may be a mixture of some of these scenarios I mentioned earlier. COVID has pushed it into using Teams. We're now using Teams successfully at home, and we're meeting people, we're collaborating on files with each other, and we're sharing with people in the organization. And for some of our organizations, to make it really good and flexible and agile, we're working with people outside our organization as well, because Teams really does that well, doesn't it? And that's part of the winning point of using Teams. Two organizations I've been working with, the main principle was that new way of easily sharing, and how do we best tie down some of the capabilities to make it a little bit more controlled in our term, and how do we increase the education and communications to make sure people know that when they're doing things subtly different. One of the biggest things as an IT project manager I came across with Teams, it's very low level this, but working in IT for years with file shares and personal drives, it's very easy to manage who's sharing what with whom, apart from email and some of the other ways that people can get around controls. But once you've got a file share, team share drive, that is fairly easy to permission by IT, but Teams is very different. Teams can permission themselves directly to allow people into their team to see the data they're using. How am I sure that those people making those decisions know what they're sharing? Has somebody put something in sensitive that an external person shouldn't see as part of their use of that Teams without really thinking about who they're sharing that document with? And then how do we think about extending that decision making around the rest of our application portfolio? Well, when I think about pulling together this team, and when we're thinking about pulling together a number of people, however many people that means in that little model I showed earlier, it could be one or two of you, it could be 3, 4, 5, or it could be somebody from each of those functions that already exist within your organization. But the piece of work ahead of us is to look at the applications, think about who uses it, think about what controls we need to apply, either by technical or by policy, could be paper policy, telling people what to do, asking people how to think about what they're doing, imposing some restrictions on what they can and can't do. How do we advertise and how do we publish and how do we make sure that's got around the organization when we're talking about high numbers of, in my past, 4,000 or 5,000 staff strong organizations, to make sure that people are aware of the existence of what we're actually trying to achieve with this team. And then it's applying the control appropriately. I mentioned the last one, when thinking about a SharePoint deployment or some other organizational change, it's very easy to get into a really large bubble of everything has to be done all at one time. And what I have found with my first iteration and with a couple of organizations, because we're trying to do all of the security controls or all of the information architecture or other elements that make up the background structures of Microsoft 365, it seems to take a long time to arrive at the big grand design stuff without actually delivering anything to the end users where they could make better use. Breaking it down into sizable chunks and accepting the risk of what we're doing as we increase the capabilities and the controls over a period of time makes a lot more sense to get the organization using the products rather than waiting for the grand designs to be resulted through some long-term, large-scale project delivery. Now, for some organizations, that might not make sense for the way that you work, but with Microsoft 365, breaking it down into really biteable chunks really does seem to make sense with a lot of the customers and clients we've been working with recently. What I'm going to do is go into a couple of case studies in a way, because this is the best way to really articulate what I'm talking about, because I'll go through some real experiences I found in my last organization and more recently with some clients I've been working with Silver Sands about how this can look. My organization, before we started bringing in operational management, we had deployed most of the applications that had no license implication. We had started thinking about user adoption. We'd implemented a champion network around the organization, which was very active and very, very dynamic. And it was actually producing quite a lot of change within the teams that belonged, but it wasn't a mandatory champion network, and there were functions that weren't represented at all, and some that had some very, very strong champions who were really pushing the way that Microsoft 365 could be used to help the way that they do their work. And there was, if I was honest, across the organization, there was a really good take up in some areas, and there were some areas that we needed to really focus on, but everybody had every application. Within Forms, we had a team that found Forms a really, really quick way of self-generating a survey or a quiz or a questionnaire or form. And they saw an opportunity to be able to develop a form for collecting some information from outside. In our case, it was a council and it was citizens around citizen services. And that was a really powerful tool because it was the first time we could do something really agile, test it out, refine the questions, refine the delivery method, and really get something out there without going through an e-form development that was in existence in IT. That was deployed to a public website and it was in use. And actually, I, as a project manager, thinking about doing some of the work around the rest of the Microsoft 365 platform, came across this in one of the sessions I had with the team concerned. And what struck me was that they actually had a really good grip on how to do this well. They had deployed it with due GDPR concerns against the form that they were developing. It was, in the end, it was a suite. It was about 3 or 4 forms, but they had thought about it in real terms about compliancy. They had no contact with our internal records management or information governance teams. They had just looked into it, see what was needed to be done, and they had a very, very good approach. The form had a statement on there about what the information was going to be collected for, who was going to be using it, where it was going to be used, the exact purposes of why it was going to be used only, and how long it was going to be kept for in any environment, and then what the deletion of that information was going to take place. Now that meant that they had, in essence, developed a process using Microsoft Forms to capture a load of information from 2 or 3 different groups of citizens, put it into a database in Forms for a short period of time, and then to analyze really briefly the responses and move that into an internal line of business application which had good industry-wide recognized security controls about the way it held the data in it. It would be deleted from Microsoft 365. Now, in a way, from our point of view as an operational management team, you couldn't have asked for a better process to be identified by one team and doing it in isolation. So what do? We grabbed them. Exemplar, champion, however you look at it, we used exactly their process and we built that into a management plan for Forms. So in a way, they had answered most of the questions about what it's for, who's using it, what the data lifecycle is from the capture through to the deletion of it within Microsoft Forms, where the data has been held longer term so that we could have a really good control of that data. And that was actually Forms a management plan iteration 1. We didn't need to do any work as a group, and it was actually done by the community users without any other investment or involvement. And that actually formed part of the starting point for how we would address some of the other capabilities within Microsoft 365. So actually using champions around the organization where you have them in place, using exemplars where they're using the products in really good depth of use. Why not use those people to help you build that management plan? And that's part of the beauty of Microsoft 365 about the users actually generating the reasons why they're using it. Another case study or another scenario I've been involved in, I've covered this a fair degree already in all 3 webinars, so I'm only going to go through this really quickly, where a license uplift was really the only activity that went on to suddenly expose and reveal all of the applications on the all staff's application list. At the point of that uplift on the 1st of April, I think it was a couple of years ago, all the applications were enabled apart from ones with license implications or development implications around Power Platform, Power BI, and some of the other what I call the advanced capabilities outside of productivity and communications. It wasn't attached to a project, so there was no people to start thinking about pulling together to do this. We had good information governance structures, and there was beginning to emerge a really good champion network that we could use to piggyback some early education and communications and trying to generate some sort of catch up to the initial deployment that didn't have any real considerations about user adoption and usability. And the other good thing about the organization was that they had good service management on all their other line of business applications. So repeatable, predictable people processes, a lot of that was in place for us. So for this one, I go back to actually the starting point was the application list or catalog or master plan. There's loads of words that we could put to this, and to actually go through, identify all the applications, what the status of those applications were, and where we then identify those applications, pull together a list of the ones that we felt were the most urgent to us to put under better control that had already been applied. And we actually did that through collaboration. So we identify the collaboration opportunities, the risks associated with internal and external sharing, and started to identify those applications, identify one, have a look at what the controls were and what the control options were possible within the product. And then as a group, because we had autonomy to do this, establish our starting point for our first iteration of governance. And although you've got all sorts of things about minimal viable product, you've got things about gold, silver, bronze, or whatever, I like to use the word just enough, good enough, better and best, because that really brings down to people is just enough. Is it good enough for us at the moment? Is it usable? Is it the level that we're willing to accept the risk against something with an action plan to get better over a period of time? So we could apply just enough today for one app and another, and then we could include in our year ahead, our action plan, some reviews of each of those so that we can start to improve our governance over time. And each of those will be fairly short cycles of review and implement so that we could deliver capability in a safe and legal, or as safe and legal as we're willing to accept the risk of, to staff so they can start using the products, not waiting for us to really go through every single thing and make sure we had every I dotted and T crossed. The final one that I just want to go through briefly is changes coming from Microsoft. A client that we're working at the moment has implemented Teams rapidly for COVID. There was a limited subset of other applications deployed, and there has been some user adoption and training, but no real formal longer-term user adoption implemented. The support desk is very active around their own self-development of Microsoft 365, and they are able to provide tactical support when people call a service desk, but it's not what I call really a cohesive one around learning about how to use Microsoft 365 and being responsive to the change that comes. And finally, there is the Microsoft Learning Pathways implemented in the organization, but it was only really implemented to educate and communicate around Microsoft Teams. So with this one, very, very simply, we've worked with them to understand where they are with their applications and what they want to implement over the next 6 months to a year, which is very little at this very moment in time. And we are going to work with them to create and update learning pathway content for any changes that are advertised by the Microsoft Roadmap or the Message Center in the admin panel. We will work with them to identify their comms channels and how we can publicize the change, and work with their learning and development team on how we can move the information out using learning pathways as a bit of the hub for all of that type of content, and then how we can supplement the learning pathways with different innovative and interesting ways to engage with the staff so that they are relying on the learning pathways, the content they get from us, and not having to go back to the service desk on the Monday after something has changed over the weekend and overloading the service desk with a number of calls. In implementing operational management, just to wrap this up a little bit, is really just to go through something I did last time. Just going to bring them all in because those have seen this before. Starting the operational management thinking, I've gone through a couple of starting points for those scenarios, depending on the type of issues you've got facing you, whether you can strategically think about bringing this in as a principle, align it with your existing people and processes, or whether you are almost, without meaning it to sound bad, reacting or forced into something because something went a little bit wrong for you. This is still very, very practical, and it can be as small as a tactical issue that's come and hit you from the side, or it can be as big as starting from scratch. Thinking about what you want to achieve, how you want to build a team, and identifying what's appropriate for your organization, so you're not building a team that's over boiled for the type of activity you want to do, but make sure you're understanding what is in front of you so you can build the appropriate size team to help support what you want to try and develop. Identifying the team, identifying the terms of responsibility for that team, really important, so that you've got a bit of a remit and a benchmark against which to judge yourself, as well as account for the presence of the team to your management. Plan and roadmap what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, whether it is against something like an application list and risk. They might be your two starting points, or it might be plan and roadmap is slightly swayed by a second COVID or a second pressure that requires you to turn something on very, very quickly. Identify your business drivers and start simple again. It's not the big stuff, but if you've got a team that you can pull together to respond to what's going on tactically coming in from this from left field for you, you can also start talking to your business about what they want to achieve with some of these products and how you can actually use the team to respond to those emerging business needs. Now, longer term, we'll be talking more about how we can use either the operational model or to think about a layer above that in terms of working with business leaders to identify how to start maximizing the use of Microsoft 365 in other areas of business that you might already be using another product or another service. In my last organization, I introduced something called Microsoft 365 First, where possible, so that we could start using the existing wonderful, massive amount of capabilities that could have replaced some of our internal systems we were already using, either around, for example, forms, as I mentioned earlier, getting either reducing or actually turning down the need to renew licenses for a forms product, because Microsoft Forms may deal with either all or 80-20 of what the capability we're paying a lot of money for in another area. It might be a business direction that A, once they get to understand what teams can do, B, they might make a decision about changing the way that they work, and they can start to work as a dynamic relationship with Microsoft 365 as a platform and start to understand how they can start influencing their business drivers by some of the capabilities that are available. So what we've done over the last three webinars is really to talk about the starting point usually is in the middle with IT. It's sometimes, and I have to say from my point of view, and it's not wrong, it's just the way it is, it's usually an IT-led project. As the project emerges and evolves, it encompasses a large number of business units that need to support that delivery, especially if you are able as an organization to put the type of resources to make it a really big success. Even at the project stage, you still have all of those boxes in red. You have those people that help you. It may be in 1 or 2 people rather than 5, 6, 7 or 8 people, but you do use comms, you do use training and user adoption people to support the delivery. You enhance your support to take on the extra number of calls that might include something's not working, but it will also include how do I and why do I. And implicit in that is some of the culture change that we're beginning to see around going towards self-reliance. So staff may not need to come to service every time to ask how do I, why do I, but where do they go and how do we help to let them understand that it's okay to look out for their own support and information, whether it's using Microsoft Learning Pathways as a curated piece of learning and education content, or even is it okay just to use Google? Is it okay to give something a go and find out it doesn't quite work for you and change your direction? Absolutely nothing wrong with that. But in some organizations, that sometimes is a challenge where traditional learning and training environments haven't really given way to that self-reliance and self-service of education content might exist. The strategic, whether it comes from internal decision making about how the platform can relieve pressures on internal storage or how it can allow us to remove one type of product for another, but in terms of the organizational strategy, how it can begin to start driving the way that the organization changes the way it works. So that's really the operational management model that I want to talk about for these last 3 sessions. The last one that I didn't want to leave anyone without is really goes back to the so what questions. How can we implement something without thinking about whether or not we're successful? And I left behind a model that was going to review something like this every 6 months to make sure it was doing, because it was new and it was investing money. It was some way of presenting back to the organization some measure of success. So these are just some. You can identify your own. I'll probably have reviewed this by next week, come up with new ones when I think about it. But with Microsoft 365 as a platform, this is looking at it holistically. So it's not just looking at it from a manager of the platform or manager of an organization or manager of a service desk, but some of the objectives with the applications, we have clear owners or we have a clear contact for someone to go to when they want to talk about things 365. That could be as much as people relating to either change or organizational change or internal or external governance. But it's just having somebody to go to mull around what either a change or a requirement is in Microsoft 365 with some expectation that that can be dealt with by that one person rather than going around the houses to see who can own it or who can deal with it today. Staff can find the information on how to use the capability with confidence. They can be more self-reliant. They're not calling the service desk every day or every week or every month. They are able to go and find out their information on things that are changing or things that are new to them. The risk of using the applications in the way that we are beginning to start exert some control is recognised and well documented and is managed. So if we are going to do just enough this month, is that okay? Is the organisation happy to sign off on that so that I can implement some just enough controls this month? And then within 3 to 5 months or whatever my cycles are around all the other applications, I can review and go towards good enough and then better. We've got effective auditing set up to identify things that support the operational management model. So how do we identify increase and confidence in use and adoption? How do we identify increased take-up of applications and confidence in using the applications with little investment from IT or little investment from the user adoption teams, even in terms of I've seen something, I want it, and I think it could suit the way I work. And that self-reliance is a really good way of identifying that you've got less pressures on other parts of your organization. Risks, identifying, auditing and managing the risks. So we've got all the risk managed. And in my last organization, we would have ICO audits, or we might have to be reviewed against national government guidelines on information governance. And we would have an action plan here that we could almost put in people's laps without any more work to say, this is our, as an example, this is our just enough measures over our highest risk areas. These are the documented, accepted risks that we're not going to work in X, Y, and Z because we don't have time and we can't do it across the whole estate. It's a really powerful tool to give back to everybody to say we're really okay and we're in control of this. If we haven't already, depending on our starting point of reactive or tactical or grander design, we can then develop a clear 365 roadmap about what we're doing, what we're developing, how we're maturing and improving our control, but also how we can support the organization to take greater advantage of some of the applications and capabilities that are there. And then finally, another more tactical one, but this is around change, and it's still one that could cause problem when change comes in that's too big for us to respond to without a management team. There's somebody that could review a roadmap as part of my operational management team or wider organizational roles, and they could bring back crucial, critical, big actions. If I got my team mature and running, I wouldn't need to wait for a monthly meeting. Somebody in the Microsoft admin area could actually go directly to the user adoption person saying, have a look at this Microsoft article. There's something big coming up in 3 months. It's going to land on the 1st of January. And I think it's going to have a really big impact to these number of users or a number of users, and the user adoption team can then pick that up as a proactive element of education and comms using anybody within the team again, so you don't have that convening knee-jerk reaction to something that's come along and caught you out. So I think that really covers everything I wanted to go through today. Are there any questions?
So thank you very much, Andy, for running us through that. We now have some time for those questions, as Andy's just mentioned. If you do want to ask a question, please just pop that in the chat box now. Whilst you do, I will quickly move on to the accelerators that we have. So just looking at the current slide, you can see that we offer 6 accelerators on the topic of user adoption. The 2 highlighted at the top are starting points for the topics we have been talking about today. So these are really centered around a 5-day engagement, focusing on where you are currently and delivering advice and guidance to get you to your desired level of management. These are fixed price starters designed to get you up and running with that user adoption journey. We also have a number of events coming up in the new year, so keep an eye out for them. They will be announced very soon. And a quick reminder, if you could, just to fill out the survey, only takes 2 minutes to complete, and we really value your feedback for improving future sessions. So just looks like there is no questions. Oh, Nick's typing. Do you have a question, Nick?
Come on, don't make it too easy for me.
It seems there's no questions today. So if anyone thinks of any at a later date, please feel free to come back to us.
Yeah, please do.
We're happy to answer these. We'll be sending out the recordings later. All that's left is to say thank you again, Andy, for a really great session. I hope everyone found that useful, and we look forward to seeing you again at a webinar soon.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys.